We now know the real reason Putin rejected a Russia-Ukraine ceasefire, and it has nothing to do with peace. For months, Ukraine and its allies have pushed for a full 30-day ceasefire. Zelensky said yes, the West backed it, Putin refused, again and again. Now a retired US general has blown the lid off why. This isn't diplomacy, it's cold, calculated strategy, and it reveals what Putin's really afraid of. Let's break down the truth behind Putin's rejection and the pressure that could finally crack his war plan. Speaking to Fox Business on May 20th, former US General Jack Keane explained that Putin is so dogged in his attempts to avoid a ceasefire because he knows that saying yes would place enormous pressure on him. Keane, who is now Fox News' senior strategic analyst, along with serving as the chairman of the Institute for the Study of War, says that Putin rejected the ceasefire because he knows full well that if he goes to a ceasefire, that stops the killing. Surely that's the point. Russia is presumably losing soldiers at a rate of around 1,000 per day, with the country's casualties edging ever closer to reaching the 1 million mark in total. The odds are that Russia will surpass those million deaths, injuries and captures at some point in June. You might think that will be enough to convince Putin that it's time to stop his ill-fated invasion. But for Putin, as Keane explains, the deaths are necessary on both sides of the war because they provide Russia's leader with leverage. And then the pressure is off the administration to make major concessions to him, Keane explains. What he means is that granting the US 30 days to negotiate with Russia means that Putin can no longer use the sheer scale of death caused by his invasion to get what he wants. Trump and Zelensky will be able to talk for 30 days without worrying about losing more of Ukraine's soldiers. Putin doesn't want that. Any discussions that happen between Ukraine and Russia must occur when Ukrainians are dying and Russia is still attacking. Putin wants Ukraine to be weakened when Zelensky comes to the table. Allowing a ceasefire gives Putin's opposition some breathing room, both to consider its position and to table a proposal that doesn't give Russia everything that it wants out of the Ukraine war, Keane explains. There's a good reason why Putin wants it this way, Keane adds. Putin wants major maximum concessions that make Ukraine so vulnerable that he will eventually be able to take control of it. He has never given up on that aspiration, Keane says. And he's not wrong. We only need to look at the conditions Putin suggested when talk of a ceasefire first began in March for proof. Following a meeting between Trump and Zelensky in that month, the proposal for a full 30-day ceasefire was presented to Putin. Initially, Russia's president seemed to welcome the concept, stating that he was in favor of the principle behind a ceasefire. However, these statements were clouded by the Kremlin, adding that it would need to consider terms before it would agree to anything. The reality was that Putin saw the ceasefire negotiations as a way to play a game with Ukraine and the US. Specifically, Russia claimed that several questions needed to be answered before it could agree to a ceasefire. Speaking alongside Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko 2 days after the 30-day ceasefire was proposed, Putin said, "There are issues that we need to discuss, and I think we need to talk about it with our American colleagues and partners, and perhaps have a call with President Trump and discuss it with him." That simple statement revealed two things. First, Putin was trying to cut Ukraine out of the entire negotiation process, which is par for the course for Russia's leader. Remember that this is a man who doesn't believe Ukraine should exist as a sovereign entity. The fact that Putin made a point that he needed to talk to Trump without even mentioning Ukraine tells us a lot about Putin's mindset. Ukraine wouldn't be invited to that conversation because Putin believes any contribution the country makes to the talks is irrelevant. Second, Putin likely wanted to speak to Trump directly because he believed that doing so would give him more opportunities to manipulate the US president. Again, that's part of Putin's modus operandi. He divides Ukraine from the US so he can speak about what he wants without having to worry about Ukraine chiming in. Specifically, Putin wanted answers relating to how the Kursk incursion would play out, whether Ukraine would be allowed to mobilize troops and receive new weapons during the ceasefire, and, most importantly, who would verify the ceasefire. Who will give orders to stop hostilities, Putin asked. Who will determine where and who has violated a possible ceasefire agreement for 2,000 kilometers? What we see here is the start of something that Putin has been doing for more than 2 months, making excuses. Excuses that conveniently allow Putin to continue waging his war while delaying any talk of a ceasefire. On April 8th, the Atlantic Council published a report highlighting that Putin is making all of these excuses because he doesn't want any sort of peace with Ukraine. By this point, the Council says Putin has already trotted out his old reasoning for invading Ukraine in the first place, claiming he was doing it to eradicate Ukrainian Nazis. That's a reasoning Putin has been using since 2014 when he annexed Crimea. Since then, Russian propaganda has depicted Ukraine as a hotbed for extremist ideology, the Atlantic Council says, Putin's goal being to dehumanize Ukraine in the eyes of his people and the rest of the world. Why? The answer is simple. Putin wants nothing less than the complete erasure of Ukraine's identity so that the country can be absorbed into Russia. That brings us back to Keane's comments about Putin's desire for control over Ukraine. Keane knows that nothing less than the full capitulation of Ukraine is good enough for Russia's leader. Everything that Putin is doing when he rejects ceasefires is designed around gaining the control he's always wanted. A ceasefire represents a barrier to that control, Keane appears to be arguing. So Putin won't agree to stop because he needs to weaken Ukraine to the point where Zelensky has no leverage at all when peace discussions finally happen. Keane appears to be right on the money. And again, we only need to look to comments Putin has made in the past to prove the point. For years, before his February 2022 invasion, Putin had been claiming that Ukraine shouldn't exist as a sovereign nation. The University of Rochester demonstrated this point back in March 2022 with a rundown of many of the claims Putin made to justify his actions. Chief among them is an argument Putin made in a 5,000-word essay titled "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians," published on the Kremlin's website in 2021. Putin asserted that Ukrainians and Russians are one people who should never have been separated in the first place. Whether this was an attempt by Putin to butter up the Ukrainian people into supporting his side of the argument or a veiled warning of what was to come next year, the general intent is clear. Putin is saying Ukraine should be part of Russia. In the essay, he argues that Ukrainian nationality isn't its own entity and is instead part of a triune that includes Russian and Belarusian nationality. Putin also argues that the two peoples share the same ancestral heritage, which he again uses to justify Russia's desire to absorb Ukraine. What Putin purposefully fails to recognize is that history doesn't influence the state of the world today. If it did, you could take his arguments in many different directions. For instance, the Soviet Union claimed 10% of Finland's territory in the wake of World War II. Should Russia give that back? Finland itself used to be part of Sweden, which was once at war with Russia, that saw both Sweden and Russia take and lose territory. Where do you draw the line? If you have to go back centuries to justify why a country that is no longer under your control should be, almost every nation on Earth would descend into territorial squabbles. The point is that Putin's historical justifications for his war against Ukraine are flimsy at best. But that doesn't matter. Russia's leader is sticking to those justifications, which again amount to the point Keane made earlier. The only way for the Ukraine war to end, in Putin's eyes, is the complete eradication of Ukraine as a sovereign entity. Any 30-day ceasefire that's announced at a time when Russia isn't already on the verge of controlling Ukraine doesn't serve Putin's ultimate purpose. So Putin says no, again and again. Instead, he proposes conditions that Ukraine simply can't accept because Putin knows that acceptance of his conditions would put Ukraine in the weakened state that he needs it to be in. Therein lies the true reason Putin keeps rejecting ceasefires, according to Keane. However, the strategic analyst also notes there are other reasons why Putin is stringing both Ukraine and the US along in what Russia's leader clearly sees as some sort of diplomatic game. Trump's desire to achieve peace as soon as possible is one of those reasons, Keane says. Prior to becoming the US president for a second term, Trump made numerous promises that he will be able to end the Ukraine war within 24 hours. Of course, that didn't happen. Most people never believed it was possible. However, these promises signaled to the rest of the world that ending the Ukraine war would be a priority for Trump once he took office. Keane says that Putin is taking advantage of that fact now that Trump has served for almost 5 months and hasn't achieved the peace he's looking for. He knows full well that President Trump came into office wanting to end this war, Keane tells Fox Business. The president has emphasized many times. He uses the term bloodbath as an example of that. He's impatient. He has a sense of urgency about it. Putin, for all of the horrors he's wrought on Ukraine, is, and always has been, a shrewd negotiator. Keane appears to be implying that Putin can sense desperation in Trump following the US president's failure to deliver on his 24-hour promise. Now Putin is trying to take advantage. He also knows the president is impatient. He drags out the negotiations and makes no concessions at any of these negotiations that have taken place. I don't expect any of it going forward, Keane adds. Here we get another sense of why Putin is rejecting ceasefires. Not only does Russia's leader know that stopping the killing takes away his leverage, but he's using his conversations with Trump to achieve something else: the normalization of the relationship between Russia and the US. With every passing day, Trump's impatience grows and Putin gains more opportunities to use that impatience to his advantage. Keane points this out. And then Putin is obviously talking to the president because he wants to avoid sanctions in his attempt to convince the president that he's interested in peace as much as the president, Keane says. Of course, his actions don't speak to that. And he's also trying to convince the president that what he wants is normalization of relationships with Russia, which would have significant economic benefits to both countries, Keane adds. Again, the point is clear and appears to be right. Though Russia has described the process of normalization as complex, it's also something that Putin knows he has to achieve. Failure to do so could lead to Russia's economy being ruined under the weight of both Putin's war effort and the sanctions that have resulted. As with the issue of Ukraine's sovereignty, Putin's rejections of a ceasefire all come down to Russia's president trying to get everything he wants out of a peace deal. Nothing less than the destruction of Ukraine and a return to doing business with the US is enough for Putin. There's just one problem. Putin may be on the verge of overplaying his hand. Keane suggests this when asked about what the US should do next, given all of Putin's ceasefire rejections. "I think the Europeans, Senator Graham and advisors have got it right. It's time to slap it hard on Putin," he says. Yes, that will affect the relationship, I grant you that. But when they're making no progress, maintaining this relationship at the expense of the people on the battlefield is simply unacceptable. We'll get to Keane's comments about Senator Graham in a moment. First, Keane wraps up by pointing out that you can't negotiate with a man who seems not to care an iota about the fate of his own people or the Ukrainians his war is killing. Putin has rushed into the front lines thousands of additional troops, trained less than a month. The killing of his own troops has gone from the high 30,000s in 2024 to the high 40,000s now, edging on 50. He increased target on civilians. He had increased the bloodbath, and Putin couldn't care less about how many soldiers are killed. Putin only cares about achieving the objectives he held long before he invaded Ukraine. And as if to prove the point, mere days after Keane held his interview with Fox Business, Russia was demonstrating just how little it actually cares about achieving a ceasefire. Over the weekend, beginning on the evening of May 23rd, Russia unleashed horde after horde of drones on Ukraine. Each attack was bigger than the one that came before, culminating in a Sunday night when Russia broke its own record for the number of drones it sent to Ukraine in a single aerial assault. Overnight on May 25th and into 26th, Russia unleashed a staggering 355 Shahid drones, killing 6 people in the process. All told, the weekend strikes killed 13 people, including 3 children from the same family, and injured dozens more. Those drone strikes are still ongoing. On May 27th, Reuters reported that though Russia's drone attacks are dipping in intensity, they show no signs of stopping. 3 more Ukrainians were injured in attacks on that evening, demonstrating precisely what Keane is pointing out. Putin will keep talking as though he's prepared for a ceasefire, but his actions speak far louder than his words. Russia's leader is doing all of this because he believes he can get away with it. He's also doing it because he has to. Letting up on the constant pressure he places on Ukraine would weaken Russia's position at the negotiating table. However, we mentioned earlier that Putin was on the verge of overplaying his hand, as he looks to delay and delay again with his ceasefire rejections. The weekend drone strikes may have finally pushed him over the edge. How do we know? Those strikes prompted a furious response from a US president that Putin has been attempting to manipulate to his agenda for months. That's according to the Kyiv Post, which wrote on May 27th that Trump is now considering placing new sanctions against Russia in response to Putin's most recent actions. Trump attacked Putin in a Truth Social post following the weekend drone strikes, stating that Russia's president has gone absolutely crazy. Previously, Trump had hoped his personal relationship with Putin would enable him to talk Russia's president into agreeing to a ceasefire. He even alludes to this in his Truth Social post, stating, "I've always had a very good relationship with Vladimir Putin of Russia, but something has happened to him." Trump went on to confirm everything that Keane said in his Fox Business interview. "I've always said that he wants all of Ukraine, not just a piece of it, and maybe that's proving to be right," Trump blared. "But if he does, it will lead to the downfall of Russia." The message from Trump was clear. Putin's attempts to play for time are failing, and the US is on the verge of punishing him for refusing to agree to a ceasefire. What will that punishment look like? We mentioned that we'd come back to Keane's comments about Senator Lindsey Graham. He, along with Senator Richard Blumenthal, has tabled a bill proposing the introduction of a new 500% tariff to hurt Russia. This tariff wouldn't apply to Russia directly, given that the US is doing very little business with Putin as it currently stands. Instead, the bill proposes implementing a 500% tariff on any nation that buys Russian gas, oil, uranium, and several other products. It's essentially a secondary sanction, and one that's designed to hurt Russia by forcing Putin's current energy customers to weigh up the pros and cons of buying cheap Russian resources against the US, making it harder to sell their products. The proposal already has massive support, with 81 senators backing it. However, Trump has been reluctant to agree to placing additional tariffs against Putin. So sure was he in his belief that he could use his relationship with Putin to bring about a ceasefire. Putin's actions, both in rejecting every ceasefire proposal and sending more drones than ever to attack Ukraine, have led to Trump realizing that talking isn't working anymore. The US needs to respond to Russia's actions with actions of its own. If there's any doubt about what Trump is planning to do, the US president may have put that doubt to bed with another Truth Social post days after he branded Putin crazy. What Vladimir Putin doesn't realize is that if it weren't for me, lots of really bad things would have already happened to Russia, and I mean really bad. Trump concluded with a simple message: he's playing with fire. All signs are pointing toward Trump growing impatient, just as Keane says. Putin believed he could play into that impatience to get what he wanted out of a peace deal. However, Russia's leader has gone so far that he now faces the prospect of the United States and a President Putin believed he could manipulate striking back. We don't know what the really bad things Trump says could happen to Russia are. Could he be talking about sanctions, the provision of more aid to Ukraine? maybe even more direct involvement by the US in the Ukraine war? We don't have the answers yet. All we know now is that Putin is still saying no to a ceasefire and that Trump is so furious about it that he's planning something. Only time will tell if Putin's attempts to play his hand to the maximum will come back to bite both him and Russia. But what do you think about Keane's explanation of the real reason why Putin won't agree to a ceasefire? Has Putin overplayed his hand by saying no so many times? Will we ever see a ceasefire, or is the Ukraine war doomed to continue until one side emerges as a clear victor? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more video commentaries on the latest developments in the ever-evolving relationship between the US and Russia.